a couple of weeks ago, it was kind of about now that it was becoming clear that one or more people party to cabinet discussions on the, it turned out to be aborted budget speech, were sharing information with journalists. And it was becoming clear, Kasatu was starting to issue media releases about it. It was clear that the budget speech, as due to be delivered, was going to contain a significant increase in VAT. 2%, 2 percentage points hadn't been put to the story yet. That came in the 24 hours or so before the budget speech was supposed to happen. What we are hearing now, and based on recent experience, perhaps we can assume that there are leaks again and that the leaks are largely reliable. What we're hearing is that there has not been full cabinet agreement on what Treasury should put in the budget, but that Treasury was left with a range of options to get the money that Treasury wants to get this year and the next 2 years, roughly 60 billion rand per year, to prevent damaging budget cuts in key areas of service delivery like health and education. And amongst the options which Treasury is still proposing is reportedly a 3/4 of a percentage point increase in VAT. Treasury appears, according to the reports, to be quite keen on this and believes that it is the least harm option. The DA, at least in public, continues to avow that it will not accept any tax increase. And the EFF has said, don't look at us, because it is being reported that some in the ANC are saying, let's go ahead, let's do what Treasury wants to do. And if the DA don't vote for the bills that give legislative effect to the budget, well, then we'll find those votes elsewhere. And the EFF probably are not going to vote for VAT increase either. So, Dr. Gilad Isaacs joins us now, Executive Director at the Institute for Economic Justice based at Wits University. Gilad, good afternoon.
Afternoon. Thanks very much, Sean.
I saw Harun Borat of UCT, hardly a great friend of capital, being quoted as saying, you know what, a VAT increase, particularly with the addition to the VAT exempt items, is not, in this case at this point, necessarily a regressive tax for South Africa, a retrogressive tax. It might actually be a progressive tax. That's not something I understand you agree with.
I agree with one element of that. So if we economists measure the progressivity of a tax by comparing the share of a individual's income which they would spend on that tax, right? So a poor person in South Africa, at the very sort of poorest person, spends about 9.5% of their disposable income on VAT, right? The highest earning individual spends about 12% of their income on VAT. So in a technical sense, and the reason why it is skewed in that way is because there are items which are exempt from VAT through zero rating, right? Without that, we would have the skew, meaning that poor people would spend a higher share of their income. What I think this sort of narrow assessment misses out on is firstly that increasing VAT, right, would alter the composition of the tax mix overall. And what it would mean is that poor people would be contributing a larger share of overall taxation than if a different tax was increased, right? So even though it is not that poor people pay a larger share of their own income on VAT, it still skews the overall tax mix towards a heavier burden on poor people. And that's self-evident because only the upper earning, say, 30% of the population pay a personal income tax. And so if one was to raise personal income tax, it would only impact the upper end. The other element to the argument that's made is not only that in this sort of limited sense it is a progressive tax, but they actually argue that it is less damaging in other ways. And I think that's the evidence for that is woefully insufficient.
I, in my very inexpert way, reading all of the contributions from the different ideological points of view on economics and society, they're no good options. I mean, we're not talking about, for South Africa, budget 2025, 2026, and the 2 years after that. We're not talking about best option. We're talking about least worst option. And I get lost. I get lost in the mists as to which is the least worst option.
I think that is totally fair. And I think what helps to anchor us is to have some criteria to assess that. So I would propose we think about four things, right? What is the impact of these options on economic growth? What's the impact on inflation? That's because we're in a globally high inflation risk environment. What's the impact on inequality? Because we're in a country with extreme levels of inequity. And what's the impact on the poorest and most vulnerable in our society? Where we've seen large increases, for instance, in hunger in South Africa, right? So if we take those four things in our mind and we look at these options, it's unequivocal, and all of the economic sort of modeling agrees that VAT is definitely worse on those last three. It's more inflationary. It is. It has a more negative impact on inequality, and it is going to impact the pockets of those least able to. There is some disagreement over which is potentially more harmful to economic growth. I would argue that given the manner in which poor and higher income households spend in South Africa, with poorer households spending more on locally made goods and higher income households spending more on imports and on savings, that to increase VAT would also be harmful to economic growth. So that's how I think about it, and then of course the alternatives have to be viable. And the point here is that we do have fairly accessible, easy to implement alternatives to VAT, which would raise significant income.
And unfortunately, time doesn't allow us to explore in this interview anyway those alternatives. But Dr. Gilad Isaacs, thank you very much. Wits University-based economist.